Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. Ever feel like cybersecurity is this mysterious black box,
Hmm.
full of jargon, impenetrable concepts?
Absolutely. It can seem that way.
Well, today we're cracking it wide open. We're aiming to turn those complex ideas into insights you can really grasp.
That's the goal.
We're embarking on a deep dive into what's called mitigation of threats and attacks in cybersecurity.
The huge area.
Yeah, and our mission here is to take these, intricate frameworks, the cutting-edge strategies, all the latest tech, and really turn it into clear, actionable knowledge for you.
So you can understand it.
Exactly.
Mm.
By the end of this, you won't just know what organizations are doing to protect themselves in this digital age, but crucially, how they're doing it, and maybe most importantly, why it matters to you personally.
Precisely. It's really about moving beyond just the buzzwords, isn't it? And
Mhm.
truly getting a grip on the foundational principles, the things that allow companies to build, resilient defenses against this threat landscape that just keeps changing.
Constantly changing, yeah.
We'll look at the architectural blueprints, those essential building blocks, and really the constant vigilance that's required just to keep digital assets safe today.
Okay, so if you're running a big company, or maybe even just a local business, where do you even begin when you start thinking about cybersecurity?
Right. It's a big
Do
question.
you just buy a ton of antivirus software and cross your fingers?
Well, hopefully not.
Yeah.
No, ideally they start with a blueprint, a structured approach. And that often leads us to something called the COSO framework.
Okay, COSO. Let's start with the basics then. What is COSO?
Sure. So COSO stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. Think of them as a leading advisory group.
Okay,
Their primary role is providing guidance, foundational stuff on internal controls, fraud deterrence, and just broader risk management.
got it.
You might have heard of their seminal 1992 internal control framework. That really became an industry benchmark.
Right, I think I have heard of that one.
And the most recent version, COS 2013, it's often visualized, pictured as the COSO cube.
A cube. Okay, why a cube?
Well, what's truly fascinating about the COSO cube isn't just that it's a three-dimensional diagram, though it is. It's how powerfully it shows the interconnectedness of all the internal control elements.
Ah, so it's not just the list.
Exactly. It's not a static checklist. It's this dynamic system where everything, ideally, works together. And beyond that, CSO also developed a companion framework specifically for enterprise risk management, ERM.
Okay.
This really emphasizes its role in helping organizations take a holistic view. It lets them assess and strategize around risk in relation to their overall business performance, not just their IT systems in isolation.
Makes sense.
This framework helps leadership understand their risk appetite, how much risk they're willing to tolerate, and make truly informed decisions across the entire organization.
So understanding COSO, even just the basics, gives you a structured way to think about how any organization, whether it's a massive tech giant or, your local corner business, how they approach security.
Yeah, it provides that structure.
It elevates cybersecurity beyond just the IT department, right? And ties it directly into broader business objectives. That's why it's so foundational.
Indeed. And it raises an important question. How do these core internal control objectives within COSO directly apply to cybersecurity? COSO actually classifies objectives into three main groups: operations, reporting, and compliance. And each one is absolutely critical for digital security.
Okay, let's break those down. First up, operations. What does that mean in a cybersecurity context?
Right. In cybersecurity, this is all about the daily performance and the safeguards protecting your IT assets. It's about ensuring effectiveness and efficiency.
So keeping the website running.
Exactly. Think about how a company ensures its website stays online, how its customer databases are kept safe, how its services keep running smoothly without interruption. These are all direct operational concerns impacted by security.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second one?
Then we have reporting objectives. These focus on ensuring that cybersecurity controls are robust enough that they don't compromise the integrity, transparency, reliability, or timeliness of reporting, both internal and external reporting, financial and non-financial.
Okay, so how does cyber fit in there?
Well, imagine a cyber attack that compromises a company's quarterly earnings reports, or maybe leaks sensitive customer data that needs to be disclosed.
Why?
That could lead to catastrophic financial damage, reputational damage. Reporting objectives demand trustworthiness and accuracy, and good cyber defenses directly underpin that trust.
Gotcha. And the third one was compliance.
Yes, compliance. This is pretty simply about adherence to governmental laws and regulations.
Right. The legal stuff.
In the cybersecurity world, this means complying with industry standards like those from NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or specific U.S. regulations like HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is huge in healthcare.
Definitely.
And globally, we have laws like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe.
So why should, the average listener care about compliance specifically?
Because the penalties and the legal repercussions for noncompliance can be really significant. We're talking major fines, lawsuits.
Right. It's not optional.
Exactly. It makes this a critical area for any organization's focus. It's not just a good idea. It's often legally mandated, serious business.
Okay. So we have the three objectives.
Yeah.
Operations, reporting, compliance. What else does COSO give us?
Well, beyond those objectives, COSO outlines 5 core components of its internal control framework. These are directly applicable to cybersecurity efforts. We can focus on maybe the most impactful ones for this discussion: control environment, risk assessment, and monitoring activities.
Okay, let's start with control environment. You hear this phrase tone at the top a lot. What's that about?
That's exactly what the control environment is. It's where the ethical values for an organization are set, creating this top-down approach that really permeates the entire COSO framework.
So leadership matters.
Hugely. Senior management plays a crucial role here. They need to champion cyber awareness, guide the IT policies, the incident response plans, and really educate the entire workforce about their roles in safeguarding digital assets.
It's like the captain of a ship declaring safety first.
Right.
If they don't prioritize it, nobody else down the line will either.
That's a perfect analogy. Their commitment truly defines the organizational culture around security. It sets the stage.
Okay. What's the next component?
Following that, we have risk assessment. This involves evaluating both internal and external factors that could pose a risk. Applied to cybersecurity, this means tailoring procedures to specifically analyze cyber risks.
Like how likely an attack is.
Exactly. Their likelihood of occurrence and also the potential magnitude of their impact if they do happen. What's crucial here is that it's not really about eliminating all risk. That's often impossible or prohibitively expensive.
Right.
It's about managing risk down to what the organization decides is an acceptable risk tolerance. And this involves continuous evaluation because cyber threats, as we said, they're constantly evolving. Yesterday's acceptable risk might be tomorrow's critical vulnerability. It's never static.
Always moving. Okay. And the third one you mentioned.
Monitoring activities. This component should be practiced on an ongoing basis. The goal is to identify areas of risk vulnerability and also to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of the controls you already have in place.
And this is super important for cyber, I imagine.
Absolutely vital. Because attacks are always evolving, what was secure yesterday might have a new vulnerability today. Examples of monitoring include things like penetration testing, where you ethically try to hack your own systems, vulnerability scanning, running periodic phishing simulations, and seeing who clicks.
Right. Testing the defenses.
Exactly. It's not just a one-time check. It's a constant adaptive process. You have to keep watching.
Okay. So CLSO gives us the big framework, the strategic lens. But like you said, a blueprint isn't a building. To truly build that digital fortress, organizations need, well, specific construction manuals, detailed instructions, which brings us to the bedrock of daily security: policies, standards, and procedures.
Exactly. Think of it like a hierarchy. At the very top level, you have security policies. These are the foundational documents. They provide an overview of an organization's security needs and its overall strategic plan for security.
The high-level stuff.
Yes, policies outline the scope of security measures, they define key terms clearly, assign roles and responsibilities, and establish what the organization considers acceptable levels of risk. Importantly, policies also serve as critical evidence of due care by senior management.
Due care.
It means they've taken reasonable steps to protect the organization against intrusions and disasters. It shows they're being responsible, which can be important legally.
Okay, so policies are the what and the why. What's next down the ladder?
The next level down consists of security standards. These are essentially the benchmarks an organization uses to actually accomplish the goals defined in those overarching security policies.
So, more specific.
Right. Standards might define a minimum level of performance, say, for password complexity, or provide recommendations on how to implement policies effectively. They translate the strategic what from the policy into more specific how-tos.
Okay, policy, standard, And then the bottom level.
At the very bottom, the most granular level, we have standard operating procedures, or SOPs. These are the really detailed documents. They specifically outline exactly how to perform specific security tasks or business processes.
Step-by-step instructions.
Precisely. They combine systems, software, maybe even physical actions, ensuring consistency in daily operations. SOPs tell you exactly what buttons to push, what forms to fill out.
This sounds like, I don't know, a lot of paperwork. Why do we need all three levels? Why can't organizations just have one big rule book?
That's a really great question, and it's because each level serves a distinct but very interconnected purpose. Policies give you the high-level strategic direction, making sure security aligns with the business goals. Standards provide measurable benchmarks to achieve those policy goals, ensuring consistency across the board.
Right.
And SOPs deliver the granular step-by-step instructions for daily execution. They make sure the strategic vision is actually carried out correctly, day to day, on the ground.
Ah, I see.
So this layered approach ensures security is comprehensive, it's consistent, right from the top strategy down to the daily tasks. It provides clarity and, importantly, accountability at each level of the organization.
That makes perfect sense now. It builds on itself. And speaking of policies, organizations often have different types of policies, right? For different areas.
Yes, exactly. They often have domain-specific policies. These help partition different organizational focus points. For instance, you might have user policies governing employee behavior related to IT use.
Like what websites you can visit.
Stuff like that, yeah. Or you might have regulatory policies to ensure compliance with specific laws. Or system-based policies that cover specific networks or software configurations. And a very common tool that organizations use to carry out security policies across these different domains is the acceptable use policy, or AUP.
Right, the AUP. Let's talk about that, because that leads into some of those common and crucial policies impacting pretty much everyone in an organization today. Let's start with that acceptable use policy, the AUP. I'm pretty sure, you've probably signed one of these at some point when starting a job.
Almost certainly.
It's essentially your digital contract, right? For
Yeah.
using company resources.
That's a good way to put it. The purpose of an AUP is really to regulate and protect the organization's technology resources. It does that by assigning responsibilities, clearly listing acceptable behaviors for employees, sometimes even vendors or contractors, and, crucially, it specifies the consequences for violating the policy.
So what kind of things does an AUP usually cover?
Oh, quite a range. It typically starts with its definition, scope, and purpose. It clarifies the acceptable use of personal devices for business activities. That's a big one now. It might identify which specific mobile devices are approved for company use. It details requirements for device maintenance, outlines confidentiality expectations. Critically, it also specifies the company's rights regarding monitoring and enforcement of actions on company devices.
The monitoring part.
Yes. And it lists restricted activities, maybe certain software downloads. It might specify required security software, like antivirus. And often it even includes the terms for termination if the policy is seriously violated.
Okay. So that's the general AUP. But you mentioned mobile devices bring their own challenges, leading to specific mobile device security policies.
Absolutely. Honestly, one of the greatest threats to an organization today can be poor management of how employees use mobile devices.
Really? That's significant.
Think about it. Smartphones, tablets, even smartwatches. These devices often access the exact same sensitive data and systems as traditional laptops and desktops, but they're out in the world, potentially on less secure networks. So, strict policies, coupled with the proper technological safeguards, things like encryption, remote wipe capabilities, are absolutely essential to channel mobile device use and manage its interaction with the company's network. Mobile device AUPs essentially become subsets of the main company-wide AUP.
Okay.
They define policies specifically for these portable gadgets. They'll stipulate things like password or PIN protection rules, maybe require multi-factor authentication, mandate encryption, set rules for web browsing, define parameters for connecting to public Wi-Fi networks, and often have very strict policies about downloading applications or files onto those devices.
That sounds complex.
The challenge here is just the sheer diversity of devices people use and also the blurring lines between personal use and professional use on the same device.
Yeah, that blurring line leads perfectly into the next one, that may be the most interesting one. Bring your own device, or BYOD policies.
Ah, yes, BYOD.
This whole concept allows employees to use their personal devices, their own phones, tablets, laptops for work-related activities, and even for connecting directly to the company's network. It offers flexibility, for sure, but wow, it must introduce a whole new layer of complex security challenges.
It absolutely does. BYOD policies definitely have unique elements that really differentiate them from general AUPs or even standard mobile policies for company-owned devices. For instance, there's that really delicate balance of monitoring and enforcement on personal devices.
This is where it gets really interesting, right? Where does a company's right to monitor end and an employee's fundamental privacy begin when it's their personal device being used for work?
It's a constant tightrope walk. Companies must enforce an appropriate level of monitoring to prevent intrusions, to protect company data, but they also need to set very clear standards for respecting employee privacy. Transparency is key here.
Definitely a tricky one. What other unique elements does BYOD bring?
Another key element is clarifying the ownership of the data on the device. While the employee obviously owns the physical phone or laptop, companies generally assert that all information pertaining to company records, clients, vendors, contacts, that's all the property of the organization, not the employee, even if it happens to be stored on that personal device.
That could cause friction.
It can if not communicated clearly. Then there's personal liability and indemnification. The policy needs to stipulate when an employee might be personally liable versus when liability falls on the company for losses, say, in the event of a data breach originating from that device.
Okay.
And finally, restricted activities and application downloads on personal devices. Even though it's the employee's own device, company BYOD policies may still disallow certain applications, maybe social media apps known for data leakage, or file sharing apps, or certain activities to prevent data breaches, data leakage, or unauthorized access back into the company's network.
So BioED offers that flexibility, which employees often really appreciate. But it clearly introduces a whole new layer of complex security challenges for organizations. Things like potentially leaking sensitive company data, maybe accidentally breaking compliance with regulations, and just providing yet another invert, another pathway for bad actors to try and access company data.
That sums it up well. And just to briefly circle back and reinforce the hierarchy we discussed, remember those security standards?
Right, the benchmarks.
Yes. Those organizational requirements, whether they're mandatory by law or regulation or adopted as industry best practices, they provide a clear course of action for implementing the policies. Think NIST frameworks, privacy laws like GDPR, or industry-specific rules like PCI DSS for handling payment card data.
Got it.
And finally, those standard operating procedures, or SOPs, remain the lowest, most detailed level of instructions. They tell you exactly how to perform specific security tasks, and a key security feature often recommended for SOPs is to segment them.
Segment them, meaning...
Meaning, don't keep all your security procedures in one massive document that everyone can access. Break them down. This ensures better need-to-know access control and prevents a situation where one person having access to the entire SOP binder creates a single point of knowledge vulnerability. If that binder walks out the door, you've got a big problem.
Makes sense. Limit the exposure.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered the overarching frameworks like COSO and the granular policies, standards, and procedures that guide an organization's security posture day to day. Now let's get into the actual, well, the physical and virtual defenses, the fortifications that protect the digital gates themselves.
Right, the technical controls.
But first, maybe we need to understand the playing field better, the digital landscape itself.
Yeah.
What exactly is a network? At its most basic level, what are we talking about when we say network?
Fundamentally, a network is just a system of connected physical and virtual devices. These can be connected with wires or wirelessly, and they communicate using different sets of rules called protocols.
Okay, so like a digital city.
That's a great analogy. In this digital city, you've got your roads and your traffic rules. Those are your protocols. They govern how all the different devices talk to each other, how data gets from point A to point B.
And who are the residents or buildings in this city? What are the key hardware components?
There are several key players. You have your computers, desktops, laptops, and increasingly mobile phones and tablets. These are your user endpoints. They're the primary way people interact with the network.
Okay.
Then you have access points, APs. Think of these as local bus stops or on-ramps for wireless devices. They provide the connection points for things like laptops and phones to link onto the main network wirelessly.
Right.
Routers are like the major traffic intersections or controllers. They direct data flow, sending packets of information to the correct destinations based on their digital addresses, their IP addresses.
Got it. Directing the traffic.
And servers are like the main office buildings or data centers in your city. They form the backbone, supporting all the computers in the network itself by performing core functions, maybe running applications, storing shared files, managing databases, authenticating users.
And there are others too, right? Like switches, hubs, gateways.
Yes, absolutely. Switches are a bit like routers, but usually operate within a smaller, local segment of the network, directing traffic more efficiently than older hubs, which just broadcast data to everyone connected. Gateways act as translators between different types of networks or protocols. Modems connect your network to the wider internet. Proxies act as intermediaries for requests. The list goes on.
So it's a complex ecosystem.
It really is. And understanding these basic building blocks is absolutely crucial because each one of these components is a potential entry point for an attacker. And therefore, each one is a point where security measures must be applied.
Okay. Now that we know the players, the components of this digital city, let's talk about the game plan for keeping them safe, the defenses. Once you understand all those different components, you realize protecting them requires, well, a multifaceted approach, not just one thing. Let's talk about some essential network security methods, what we might call the digital moat around the castle.
A critical strategy, and maybe one that isn't always obvious, is network segmentation or isolation.
Segmentation, what's that?
This is the process of controlling network traffic specifically to separate it into distinct segments within an organization's network, or sometimes to isolate the entire internal network from outside communications more effectively.
Why would you do that? What's the benefit?
The benefit is huge. It creates what you could call pocketed isolation. This significantly improves overall network security.
Oh, so.
Think of it like watertight compartments on a ship. If one section gets breached, if water gets in, the whole ship doesn't necessarily sink.
Ah, okay. Containment.
Exactly. An attacker gaining access to one segment of the network won't automatically have free reign across the entire network. It limits their ability to move laterally, making breaches much harder to escalate.
Okay, segmentation. That's clever. Now the one everyone knows, the firewall.
Yes, you can't talk network security without mentioning the firewall. It's absolutely fundamental, a foundational defense.
What exactly is it doing?
Firewalls can be physical hardware devices, they can be software programs, or often a combination of both. Their core job is to filter and monitor all incoming and outgoing network traffic based on a predefined set of security rules.
Okay.
Essentially, they act like a gatekeeper, examining each packet of data and deciding whether to allow it through or block it, aiming to stop malicious activity from attackers before it even reaches internal systems. They are truly the first line of technical defense for many networks.
Got it. What about wireless networks? Anything specific there?
For wireless networks, there's the Service Set Identifier, or SSID. That's basically just the name of your Wi-Fi network that you see when you try to connect.
Like my home Wi-Fi.
Exactly. Now, while it seems simple, a common security tip, particularly for organizations, is to consider disabling SSID broadcasting.
Hiding the name. Why?
It makes the network less visible. It reduces its beacon effect to nearby devices. If attackers can't easily see your network exists, it makes it slightly harder for them to target it. It's a form of security through obscurity, not foolproof, but adds a small hurdle.
Okay. Next up, something many people use, especially for remote work.
Yeah.
The virtual private network, or VPN.
Ah, VPNs. Very important. A VPN essentially creates a secure, encrypted virtual network that's built on top of existing physical networks like the public internet.
So it's like a secret tunnel.
That's a perfect way to describe it. It's essential for secure remote access. One of the key ways VPNs achieve this security is through a process called tunneling.
Tunneling.
Yeah, tunneling is where the data packets of one protocol, say your internal network data, are encapsulated, sort of wrapped up, inside the packets of another protocol for transmission across the public network. This creates that protected tunnel you mentioned.
Clever.
Another critical technology often used with VPNs is IPsec, which stands for Internet Protocol Security. IPsec uses cryptography complex math for encryption, access control, and ensuring the authenticity of the data. It can encrypt the entire data packet or just the payload, which is the actual data being sent.
So the relevance here is clear. VPNs provide secure remote access for employees back to company applications, data, and systems. vital in today's world with so much remote work.
Absolutely critical.
Now, sticking with wireless, you mentioned WPA earlier, Wi-Fi protected access.
Right. WPA is a security protocol specifically designed to encrypt the traffic flowing between a wireless access point like your router and a mobile device like your laptop or phone.
And it's evolved, hasn't it?
It has. WPA was the first step. Its successor, WPA2, added an extra, stronger layer of data encryption using something called the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES, that made it much more secure. And now, the newest iteration is WPA3. This provides even stronger security through more sophisticated encryption methods, more secure handshakes. That's the initial process of establishing a secure connection and better protections against password-guessing attacks.
So it keeps getting better.
It really highlights that continuous arms race between attackers trying to break encryption and defenders trying to strengthen it. Security is never static.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about network-wide defenses like firewalls and segmentation and wireless security. What about protecting the individual devices on the network?
That leads us to endpoint security. This is the crucial notion that every single device, also sometimes called a host or an endpoint connected to the network, should have some form of local security. Security that's separate from and in addition to any network-wide security measures like the firewall.
So security on the actual laptop or phone itself.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Every laptop, every phone, every server needs its own dedicated guard dog. Because even if the main network perimeter is secure, an individual endpoint can still be compromised, maybe through phishing or malware downloaded directly onto it.
Right, makes sense. What kind of safeguards are we talking about for endpoint security?
It includes things like having up-to-date antivirus and malware screening software installed and running, implementing strong authentication and authorization controls right on the device, maybe auditing software that logs activity on the endpoint, local host firewalls that provide another layer of filtering specific to that machine, and even host-based intrusion detection or prevention systems, HIDs or HIPS, running locally.
And building on that idea of protecting every individual device, every endpoint, we come to something called system hardening. What's that about?
System hardening is really a comprehensive approach. Its goal is to reduce risk by minimizing the attack vectors or attack surface on a system.
Attack vectors, meaning entry points.
Essentially, yes. Access points are vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit to gain unauthorized access or cause damage. System hardening tries to close as many of those potential doors as possible.
And this applies everywhere.
Pretty much. It applies across the board to applications, databases, operating systems, servers, networking equipment. Basically, every aspect of the IT infrastructure can and should be hardened. It gives attackers fewer opportunities to access and infiltrate a system.
Can you give some examples of what hardening actually looks like in practice?
Sure. Let's take database hardening. This might involve creating different privilege levels within the database itself, ensuring a clear separation between, say, database administrators who need full control and regular users or applications that only have very limited tiered need-to-know access to specific data tables. Another key part of database hardening is encrypting the data at rest, meaning the data stored in the database files, not just data moving across the network. This significantly limits the damage if a database is somehow breached, either internally by a rogue employee or externally by an attacker. Even if they get the files, the data is scrambled.
Makes sense. What about hardening the devices people use every day, like laptops?
That's endpoint hardening. Common measures include removing administrative rights from standard users on their local devices. Most users don't need admin rights for their daily work, and removing them prevents them from installing unauthorized software or accidentally making system changes that could create vulnerabilities.
Right. We've all probably wanted to install something and been blocked by IT.
Exactly. Other endpoint hardening steps include restricting users from downloading certain types of files from the internet or email attachments, maybe blocking USB drives, and definitely implementing local firewalls and malware screening on all laptops and desktops, as we mentioned under endpoint security.
So this makes it harder for users to inadvertently compromise the network because, let's be honest, we all make mistakes sometimes, right? Clicking on a bad link.
It happens. The human element is often the weakest link, so hardening the endpoint helps mitigate that risk.
Okay. What about the network itself? Can you harden that?
Yes, network hardening. This often involves things like carefully revising firewall rules to remove any rules for unused ports or services, Blocking unnecessary network protocols that aren't required for business operation, basically reducing the overall attack surface that the network exposes to potential threats from the outside world or even from other internal segments. You only want to leave open the absolute minimum necessary for things to function.
Tightening things up. And servers.
And finally, server hardening. This involves a range of practices. It includes physically segregating critical servers in secure rooms or data centers. It might mean further separating backup servers geographically from the primary servers. If a fire or flood hits one location, your backups are safe elsewhere.
Good point. Disaster recovery.
Exactly. Server hardening also involves rigorously testing new servers in isolated environments before connecting them to the production network, and even performing security tests like vulnerability scans on operational servers, perhaps during off hours to minimize disruption. The goal is providing redundancy and isolation for those absolutely critical assets.
Okay, hardening covers a lot. Is there anything else in this area of network and device protection?
Well, another method sometimes used, though it has limitations, is media access control, or MA filtering.
MC filtering. I think I've seen that setting on my home router.
You probably have. It's a form of filtering where a network access point, like your Wi-Fi router, is configured to block unauthorized devices based on a list of approved MSE addresses.
NMS address is.
It's a unique hardware identifier embedded in every network interface card, whether it's Wi-Fi or Ethernet. Think of it like a device's fingerprint for network connections. So with MSE filtering, only devices whose MSE addresses are on the allow list can connect to the network.
Sounds pretty secure then.
Well, here's the caveat. While it can be helpful as one layer in your security, MA filtering alone is considered relatively weak.
Why is that?
Because MES addresses can be quite easily spoofed. An attacker can figure out an allowed MAC address and then configure their own device to impersonate it, bypassing the filter.
Ah, okay, so not foolproof.
Not at all. It's best used as part of a broader, multi-layered security approach, maybe alongside strong Wi-Fi encryption like WPA3 and strong passwords, but never relied upon as your sole defense against unauthorized network access.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture frameworks like COSO, the policies, the standards, the SOPs. We've dug into fortifying the network itself, firewalls, segmentation, VPNs, and hardening the individual devices. But what about controlling who actually gets into these systems and what they're allowed to do once they're there?
Right. This brings us squarely into the realm of authorization and authentication. These are really the gatekeepers of the digital world.
Gatekeepers, I like that.
Exactly. Beyond the purely technical defenses like firewalls, organizations absolutely must implement practices and principles that complement these tools. Some of the most prevalent and important concepts today include zero trust, the principle of least privilege, the need-to-know principle, and the concept of whitelisting versus blacklisting.
Okay.
These aren't just abstract ideas. They're often engineered directly into an organization's IT architecture and deeply embedded in its security policies.
Let's start with the one that feels like, I don't know, a really radical shift in thinking. Zero trust. You often hear that phrase associated with it. Never trust, always verify. Well, that's the biggest misconception people have about zero trust, or maybe where does it fundamentally diverge from how most companies use to secure their networks?
That's a great question because it is a fundamental shift. It really challenges the core assumption of older security models, which was basically build a strong perimeter defense like a castle wall and then implicitly trust anyone or anything that's already inside that wall.
Right. Trusted internal network.
Zero trust completely throws that idea out. It eliminates this concept of implicit trust in any single element, user, device, network, location, application. Instead, it demands continuous verification. It focuses on users, assets, and resources in real time, every time they try to access something, to determine access rights and other system responses.
Continuous verification. That sounds intensive.
It can be, but the technology has evolved to support it. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, even established a formal model called the Zero Trust Network Architecture, or ZTNA, to help organizations implement these principles.
Okay.
ZTA is specifically designed to prevent data breaches and, importantly, limit internal lateral movement. That's when an attacker gets one foothold inside the network and then uses that access to move sideways and compromise other systems. ZTA acknowledges that threats exist both outside and inside traditional network boundaries.
So no more assumed safety inside the walls.
None. Under Zero Trust, all devices and data sources are considered resources that need protection. All communications must be secured, regardless of network location, even traffic moving between servers within the same data center.
Ah.
Access is granted strictly on a possession basis, not indefinitely. And access decisions are determined by dynamic policies that can take multiple factors into account, not just a static password.
Wow.
It truly means treating every access request every single time as if it's potentially coming from a hostile environment. Verify first, then grant access.
Okay, that's zero trust. What about least privilege? That sounds kind of intuitive.
It is, but it's incredibly important and often violated. Least privilege is the principle that users, applications, and systems should be granted the absolute minimum level of authorization and system resources needed to perform their specific required function or job task. No more, no less.
So don't give everyone admin rights just in case.
Exactly. And IT administrators need to put safeguards in place to prevent something called privilege creep.
Privilege creep.
Yeah, it's really common. An employee gets promoted or changes roles. They're granted new permissions for their new job, but the old permissions from their prior role, which they no longer need, are never actually removed. Over time, their access level just keeps growing, often far beyond what they actually require. That violates least privilege and creates unnecessary risk.
Ah, I can see how that happens easily.
Yeah.
Okay, and closely related, you mentioned the need-to-know principle. How is that different from least privilege?
It's a subtle but important distinction. Least privilege is primarily about the level of access or permissions needed for a job function. Can you read this file? Can you write to this database? Can you execute this program?
Okay.
Need to know, on the other hand, is more focused on the data itself. It follows the idea that employees should only be given access to the specific information or data sets they absolutely must know to perform their job effectively.
So I might have permission to access a whole database, least privilege, but maybe I only need to know the data in one specific table. Need to know.
Precisely. You might have the technical ability, privilege, but not the business justification, need to know, to see certain sensitive data, even if it's within a system you have access to. Both principles work together to minimize exposure.
Got it. Okay, and the last concept you mentioned here was whitelisting versus blacklisting.
Right. This relates to controlling what software is allowed to run in an environment. Whitelisting is the process where an organization identifies a specific list of applications that are authorized and approved to run on its systems. Then, the security systems are configured to allow only those programs on the list to execute. Everything else is blocked by default.
Okay, only the good stuff runs.
Exactly. Blacklisting, conversely, identifies a list of applications that are known to be unauthorized or malicious. The security systems then prevent only those specific applications on the blacklist from running. Everything else is allowed by default.
So whitelisting seems much more restrictive.
It is, and that's generally why it's considered a stronger security posture, although it can sometimes be more challenging to manage.
How so? Why is it stronger?
Think of it this way. Whitelisting is like a very exclusive private club. You only let in people whose names are specifically on the guest list. Everyone else is turned away.
Okay.
Blacklisting is more like a public venue with a banned list at the door. You let everyone in unless their name is on that specific list of troublemakers. The problem is, it's much harder to keep that ban list perfectly up to date with every single potential threat out there. New malicious software appears constantly.
I see. With blacklisting, you might miss something new and dangerous. With whitelisting, you're inherently safer because you only allow known good things.
That's the core idea. Whitelisting is proactive, blacklisting is reactive.
Makes sense. Okay, so we understand these core principles. Zero trust, least privilege, need to know, whitelisting. Now let's talk about the specific techniques that technologies used to actually identify and verify who you are in the digital world.
Right. Before we dive into the technologies, it's useful to quickly clarify the difference between identification and authentication.
Okay, they sound similar.
They do, but they're distinct steps. Identification is simply the act of claiming one's identity. Saying, I am this user. This could be by entering a username, showing an ID card, providing an email address.
Just stating who you are.
Exactly. Authentication, on the other hand, is the process of validating or proving that identity claim. It's the step where the system verifies that you really are who you say you are. This is done using things like passwords, scanning that ID card, responding to a push notification on your phone, using a fingerprint.
So first you identify yourself, then the system authenticates that identity.
Correct. It's a two-step process. Claim identity, then prove identity.
Okay. Now, beyond the basic username and password combo, there's a whole suite of more advanced authentication technologies available today to secure access to confidential data and networks, right?
Absolutely. Passwords alone are often not enough anymore. Organizations use a variety of techniques. One interesting example is context-aware authentication.
Context-aware. What context?
This is often used for mobile device users. It analyzes various contextual data points associated with the login attempt. Things like the time of day, the user's current geographic location, based on GPS or IP address, the specific access point they're connecting from, the device's security posture.
And how does that help authenticate?
Well, the system builds a profile of typical user behavior. If a login attempt suddenly comes from a completely new country the user has never been to, or at 3 a.m. when they usually work 9 to 5, the system might flag it as suspicious and trigger additional verification steps, even if the password was correct. It adds a layer of behavioral analysis.
Clever. Okay, what else?
We also have digital signatures. You might see these used with documents or emails. A digital signature is essentially an encrypted electronic stamp of authentication. Its primary purpose is non-repudiation.
Non-repudiation, meaning?
Meaning, the sender cannot later deny having sent the message or signed the document. It provides proof of origin and integrity. They utilize cryptography, specifically public key cryptography. The sender encrypts or signs the message digest with their private key, and the receiver can use the sender's public key to decrypt it and verify that the signature is valid and the message hasn't been tampered with.
Okay, so it proves who sent it and that it wasn't changed. Useful for contracts and things.
Very useful. Then there's single sign-on, or SSO. This is a big one for convenience.
Right, I use SSO for work. Log in once, access multiple apps.
Exactly. SSO is an authentication technique that allows users to authenticate just once for a single session, maybe when they start their workday, and then subsequently access multiple different authorized resources, applications, or devices without having to log in repeatedly to each one.
Like sometimes you log into an app on your smart TV and it gives you a code, and you just enter that code on your phone, which is already logged in. Is that SSO?
That's a common implementation of it, yes. Linking devices through an existing authenticated session. The big benefit is obviously user convenience, fewer passwords to remember and enter. But the potential downside is that if that single SSO credential gets compromised, an attacker could potentially gain access to all the linked applications. So securing the SSO process itself is critical.
Right, a single point of failure if not protected well.
Yeah.
Okay, now, the one you hear about constantly, and for good reason, multi-factor authentication, or MFA.
Yes, MFA. If you take only one thing away from this entire deep dive for your own personal digital security, it should be this. Use MFA wherever possible.
Emphatic. Why is it so important?
Because it dramatically increases security compared to just a password. MFA is an authentication method that requires the user to provide 2 or more different verification factors to successfully authenticate.
Factors. What kind of factors?
They usually fall into 3 categories. 1, something you know, like a password, a PIN, an answer to a security question. 2, something you have, like a smartphone receiving a code or push notification, a physical security key or fob, a smart card. 3, something you are, a biometric factor like a fingerprint, facial recognition, iris scan.
Okay, so password plus a code from your phone is common MFA.
Very common, yes. By requiring multiple different types of factors, MFA makes it significantly harder for an attacker to gain access, even if they manage to steal your password. They would also need to steal your phone or somehow bypass that second factor. It vastly improves account security.
Use MFA. Got it. What about just personal identification numbers, PINs? Like for bank cards.
PINs are essentially short numeric codes. They're a form of something you know. They are most effective when used in combination with other factors, like needing the physical bank card, something you have, plus the PIN, something you know. As a standalone factor, short PINs can be vulnerable. Organizations often enforce rules for strong PINs, regular changes, no duplication across systems, a minimum length, often 6+ characters now, and limiting the number of incorrect entry attempts before locking the account.
Okay. What about physical things? You mentioned smart cards and tokens.
Right. Smart cards are typically plastic cards, similar to credit cards, but they contain an embedded microprocessor chip. They can be used for authentication, often requiring insertion into a reader, and sometimes a PIN as well. They're common for physical access control or secure logins.
And tokens.
Security tokens are usually small hardware devices that users carry. They generate passcodes for authentication. There are different types. Synchronous tokens often display a code that changes based on time, like every 60 seconds, synchronized with the server. Asynchronous tokens might generate a code based on a challenge response mechanism using a built-in algorithm. Both provide a dynamic something you have factor.
Okay. And the last category of factors, biometrics, things like fingerprints and face scans.
Yes, biometrics is an authentication technique that uses unique human physical characteristics or even behavioral patterns to verify identity. Examples include facial recognition, fingerprint scanning, iris or retina scans, voice recognition, even potentially keystroke dynamics or handwriting patterns.
Sounds very futuristic, but it's pretty common now on phones. What are the pros and cons?
The big pros are convenience, you don't have to remember anything, and the fact that biometric factors are unique and generally very hard to guess or steal remotely. However, there are cons. A major one is that if your biometric data is somehow compromised, it's effectively irrevocable. You can't just change your fingerprint like you change a password.
It's a scary thought.
It is. There are also significant privacy concerns around the collection, storage, and potential misuse of sensitive biometric data. And biometric systems aren't always perfect. They can sometimes have issues with accuracy, false positives or negatives. So they're powerful, but need careful implementation and strong safeguards.
Okay. So while all these advanced methods, MFA, biometrics tokens, are great and increasingly important, the humble password still remains critical in most systems, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's still often the first line of defense, or at least one component in MFA.
But it comes with its own big set of challenges and weaknesses. Let's talk about passwords. Strong password management is just so critical, isn't it? Because despite all these other fancy technologies, the password is still probably the most common form of authentication people encounter day to day.
It absolutely is. And unfortunately, it's also still one of the most common ways attackers try to break into systems.
What are the main weaknesses of passwords? Why are they such a problem?
Well, there are several inherent weaknesses, mostly related to human behavior, honestly. People often use passwords that are incredibly easy to guess, things like password 123, their pet's name, their birthday.
Guilty is charged, maybe in the past.
Ah, we've probably all been there.
Yeah.
People also frequently reuse the same password across multiple different websites and accounts. This is hugely risky because if one site gets breached and your password leaks, attackers will try that same email and password combination everywhere else.
Right, the domino effect.
Exactly. Other common issues. People share passwords, they never change them even after years, or they write them down maybe on a sticky note right next to the computer because complex passwords are hard to remember.
That sticky note problem completely defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
It really does. And technically, short passwords are very vulnerable to automated attacks called brute force attacks. This is where attackers use software to rapidly try every possible combination of letters, numbers, and symbols until they guess the right one. The shorter the password, the faster this works.
I like it.
Plus, the company databases where these passwords, hopefully hashed, are stored, are themselves frequent targets for attackers. Gaining access to that database is a goldmine.
Okay, so passwords have lots of problems. How do organizations try to combat these weaknesses? Through complexity standards.
Yes, password complexity standards are paramount. The single most important factor is length. The longer a password is, the more secure it becomes, and the increase in security is exponential, not linear.
Exponential.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, think about it simply. A 4-character password using only lowercase letters has about 450,000 possible combinations. A brute force attack could crack that almost instantly. An 8-character password using upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols has something like 218 trillion combinations. That takes vastly more computing power and time to crack. Adding just a few characters makes a massive difference.
Wow, okay. Length is key. What do standards typically recommend?
NIST, the standards body, recommends a minimum of 8 characters, but honestly, that's increasingly seen as too short. Many security-conscious companies now require 12, 15, or even more characters. Frequent changes are also widely recommended, often forcing users to change passwords every 45, 60, or 90 days. Though there's some debate now about whether very frequent changes just lead to weaker passwords.
Right, because people just increment a number at the end.
Exactly. So length and complexity using different character types are generally seen as more critical than super frequent changes, especially if combined with MFA.
This still sounds like a lot for users to remember. If you have dozens of long, complex, unique passwords, How do organizations manage this without expecting every employee to be a memory champion or resort to sticky notes?
That's where technology like password managers and secure password storage comes in. Good password management applications help users generate, store, and fill in strong, unique passwords for different sites. And critically, how organizations store passwords on their own servers is vital.
How should they store them? Not just in plain text, I hope.
Absolutely not. Passwords should never be stored in plain text. Instead, programs should store passwords using a technique called hashing, often combined with salting.
Hashing. What's that?
Hashing is a one-way cryptographic process.
No.
It uses a mathematical algorithm, like the secure hash algorithms, SHAs, to convert the user's plain text password into a fixed-length string of scrambled, illegible text called a hash. This process is designed to be one way you can easily compute the hash from the password, but it's computationally infeasible to reverse the process and get the original password back from the hash.
Okay, so how does the system check your password when you log in?
When you enter your password during login, the system takes your input, runs it through the same hashing algorithm, and computes a new hash value on the fly. It then compares this newly computed hash to the stored hash value associated with your username in its database. If and only if the two hash values match, access is granted.
Ah, so the system never needs to know or store your actual password in a readable format.
Precisely. The huge benefit is that if an attacker manages to steal the password database, they don't get a list of usable plain text passwords. They just get a list of these scrambled hash values. Cracking those hashes to find the original passwords is much, much harder and more time-consuming than just having the passwords themselves. It adds a significant layer of protection.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, beyond just creating and storing passwords, there's the whole process of setting up user accounts in the first place, right? When someone joins the company.
Yes, that's generally referred to as provisioning. It's a key process within identity and access management. Provisioning is where an organization creates a new user's account and assigns the initial set of privileges, permissions, and access rights, usually based on their specific job role or function.
Is this automated?
Often, yes, especially in larger organizations, it's an automated workflow, but it's a highly protected process. It's critical for creating a valid identification credential that can then be used for authentication later on. Provisioning typically happens during the employee onboarding process, often after background checks have been completed.
What's the flip side? When someone leaves?
That's just as critical, if not more so. The process must ensure that user system credentials and all associated access rights are promptly removed or disabled when access is no longer authorized, for instance, when an employee leaves the company, is terminated, or even just changes roles significantly and no longer needs their old access. This is called deprovisioning, and failing to do it quickly is a major security risk.
Right. Leaving old accounts active is asking for trouble.
Absolutely. Service auditors, like those performing SOC2 engagements, often inspect access request forms and deprovisioning logs very carefully to confirm that proper approvals were obtained before access was granted and that access was removed in a timely manner when it ended.
Okay, one last thing in this section. Device authentication. We talk about authenticating the user, but what about authenticating the device they're using?
Yes, device authentication is another layer that can be added. This focuses on validating the identity of the actual device that's making a connection request, rather than solely relying on the user's credentials.
How does it do that?
It might involve checking for a unique identifier associated with the device, like its specific IP address, though those can change, or, more commonly, its hardware MSC address. Some systems might use digital certificates installed on approved devices. The idea is to ensure the connection is coming from a known, trusted, or company-managed device.
Is this strong on its own?
Generally, no. Much like mass filtering, device authentication is considered relatively weak as a standalone method. IP addresses can change or be masked, MSE addresses can be spoofed, certificates can potentially be stolen.
So best used with other methods.
Exactly. It's most effective when used to strengthen a multi-factor authentication approach. For example, a policy might require a user to enter their correct password and be connecting from a device that has a valid company certificate installed. It adds another hurdle for attackers.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. The guiding frameworks and policies, the network fortifications, the endpoint defenses, and how organizations manage who gets in and authenticates them. But what happens when new threats emerge, or when unforeseen weaknesses are discovered in the software or configurations you're using?
Right. Security isn't a one-time setup. It's a continuous process.
That's where we shift gears a bit, moving from static defenses to a more proactive, ongoing process. Vulnerability management. So let's define it. What exactly is vulnerability management?
Vulnerability management is fundamentally a proactive security practice. It's designed specifically to prevent the exploitation of IT vulnerabilities, weaknesses, or flaws that could potentially harm a system or the entire organization if discovered by an attacker.
So it's about finding the cracks in the armor before the bad guys do.
That's the perfect analogy. It's an absolutely integral part of modern computer and network security, and it plays a vital role in overall IT risk management.
What does the process actually involve?
It's a continuous cycle. It involves systematically identifying known vulnerabilities within your systems and software, then classifying them based on severity and potential impact. Then figuring out how to mitigate the risk, which might mean patching, reconfiguring, or adding compensating controls.
Yeah.
And finally, fixing or remediating those vulnerabilities.
Identifying, classifying, mitigating, fixing a cycle.
Exactly. And to meet these objectives effectively, an organization needs robust procedures. They need detection and monitoring tools to identify configuration changes that might introduce new vulnerabilities. They need to conduct periodic vulnerability scans, especially after any significant changes to the IT environment. And, critically, they must take action to actually remediate the identified deficiencies on a timely basis. Just finding them isn't enough.
Right. Finding a hole is step one. Actually patching it is step two. It sounds like a constant state of vigilance and improvement.
It has to be. The threat landscape changes daily.
So how do organizations actually do this proactive work? What are the tools and frameworks they use?
There are several key tools and frameworks. One of the most widely adopted and respected frameworks for implementing vulnerability management and indeed overall cybersecurity risk management is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF. We mentioned NIST earlier.
Right, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Their framework helps with vulnerability management.
Yes, it provides a really comprehensive, structured approach. It's not just a checklist, it's a whole life cycle for managing cybersecurity risk. And vulnerability management fits neatly within it.
How is it structured? What are the main parts?
The NIST CSF outlines 5 core functions. Think of them as the high-level pillars of a successful cybersecurity program, forming a continuous life cycle.
Okay, what's the first function?
First is identify. This function is all about developing an organizational understanding to manage cybersecurity risk to systems, assets, data, and capabilities. It involves discovering what assets you have, understanding the business environment they operate in, knowing your governance policies, performing risk assessments, and specifically, identifying vulnerabilities present in your systems, data, assets, and even potential weaknesses related to employees.
So know thyself, basically. Know what you need to protect.
Precisely. The second function is protect. Once you know what you have, this focuses on developing and implementing the appropriate safeguards to ensure delivery of critical services. It involves creating measures to manage identity and access controls, like we discussed, implementing data security, ensuring asset security through hardening and maintenance, and importantly, raising employee awareness and providing training about threats.
Okay, identify, then protect. What's next?
Third is detect. This function is about developing and implementing activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event quickly. This involves searching for anomalies and unexpected events, implementing continuous security monitoring across networks and systems, and having processes in place to rapidly detect potential vulnerabilities or intrusions.
Finding problems as they happen, or ideally just before.
Exactly. The fourth function is respond. Once a vulnerability or a security event is detected, this function focuses on having activities in place to take action. This includes analyzing the issue, containing the impact, executing mitigation activities to prevent the vulnerability from affecting other parts of the organization, eradicating the threat, and effectively communicating the issue and the chosen response plan to relevant internal and external stakeholders.
Taking action when something bad is found.
Right. And the final function is recover. This helps an organization plan for resilience and transition back to normal operations after an incident or after mitigating a vulnerability. Relevant activities involve implementing a recovery plan, making improvements to processes based on lessons learned, and communicating internally and externally about the recovery efforts and the return to a stable state.
Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It really covers the whole life cycle.
It does. And it's crucial to remember, like you said, this isn't a strictly linear process. It's a continuous cycle. The recover and respond phases feed back into identify and protect as you learn from incidents and adapt your defenses. Things are always evolving, new threats emerge, so the cycle constantly repeats.
That makes sense. Okay, so the NIST CSF provides the overarching framework. What about specific tools used within that framework? You mentioned scanners.
Yes, organizations heavily rely on vulnerability scanners. These are specialized software applications designed to automatically test a company's systems, networks, and applications for known security weaknesses or
How do
vulnerabilities.
they work?
They typically work by checking the target systems against a large, regularly updated database of known vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and potential security holes. They might scan for open network ports that shouldn't be open, analyze the data packets moving on the network to identify risky protocols, try to fingerprint the operating systems and application versions running on devices to see if they have known flaws. Basically, they probe the systems looking for weaknesses outlined in their database.
So they automate the identify part of the NIST framework.
They're a key tool for the identify and detect functions, absolutely. But here's a crucial warning.
Oh.
Attackers use these exact same tools, or very similar ones. They scan targets looking for the same vulnerabilities that the defenders are looking for. In fact, sophisticated attackers often time their attack campaigns to launch shortly after major software vendors release security updates or patches.
Why then? That seems counterintuitive.
Because they know that many organizations are slow to test and deploy those patches. There's often a window of opportunity, sometimes days or weeks, between when a vulnerability becomes publicly known and a patch is available, and when a significant number of organizations have actually applied the fix. Attackers exploit that lag time.
Wow. Okay. So patching quickly is critical.
Absolutely. Which leads us nicely into patch management later. Before that, though, there are also vulnerability assessments.
How are those different from just running a scanner?
A vulnerability assessment is a broader process. It typically starts as part of an initial risk analysis when setting up systems, and then it's usually performed periodically, maybe quarterly or annually, depending on the organization's risk profile and regulatory requirements. Assessments often utilize vulnerability scanners as a primary tool, but they also involve analyzing the scanner results, prioritizing the findings based on risk, potentially doing some manual verification, and reporting on the overall security posture.
So the assessment adds context and analysis to the scan results.
Exactly. A key challenge revealed by assessments, though, is that sometimes a company identifies a vulnerability but finds they can't immediately implement the recommended solution, perhaps because the fix would significantly hinder critical business operations, or maybe the patch breaks compatibility with other essential systems.
What happens then?
In such cases, the company might have to make a difficult risk-based decision to continue operating in that exposed state, perhaps with compensating controls in place, until a better, less disruptive solution can be found or developed. It's a balancing act.
That sounds stressful.
It can be, but vulnerability assessments also have ancillary benefits beyond just finding flaws. They provide management with an aggregate view of IT security processes, highlighting trends or systemic weaknesses. And they can reveal how vulnerabilities in one seemingly isolated area might unexpectedly impact other parts of the organization due to interdependencies.
Okay, so identifying vulnerabilities is key. But with new ones being discovered all the time, how does everyone stay on the same page? How do scanners and security tools even know what to look for?
That's where a crucial resource called the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE dictionary, comes in.
CVE dictionary.
Yes. It's essentially a standardized database, a public list of known cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Each distinct vulnerability that's discovered and verified gets assigned a unique CVE identifier, like CVE 2023-12345.
Who manages this dictionary?
It's maintained by the Mitigation Corporation, a nonprofit organization with funding from the U.S. government, but it's used globally. As new vulnerabilities are discovered by researchers, vendors, or others, they are reported, validated, and added to this dictionary with a unique CVE ID.
Why is this standardization so significant?
It's hugely significant. Think of it like having a universal language for security flaws. Before CVE, different security companies, researchers, and IT departments might identify the exact same vulnerability but give it different names or descriptions. That made it incredibly difficult to track, manage, and communicate about security gaps effectively.
Right, total confusion.
Exactly. Now, CVE identifiers are used consistently across the industry. Vulnerability scanners use CVE IDs in their databases and reports. Software vendors reference CVE IDs when they release patches. Cybersecurity products can communicate using CVEs. This allows customers, IT teams, and everyone involved to know precisely which specific vulnerabilities have been identified, which ones have been mitigated by a patch, and which ones they still need to worry about. It's essential for global defense coordination.
A universal translator for security bugs.
Got it.
Got it. Now, you mentioned patches. Finding vulnerabilities is one thing, fixing them is another. This brings us to patch management.
Yes, patch management works hand in hand, inextricably linked with vulnerability management. As bugs, flaws, or security vulnerabilities are discovered in software applications or operating systems, often identified by CVEs, the software vendors work to develop fixes. These fixes are released as updates, commonly called patches.
Like the updates we get for our phones or computers all the time.
Exactly like those. Effective patch management is the organizational process for managing these updates. It's not just about clicking install, it typically involves several steps.
What are the steps?
First, IT administrators need to become aware of a new patch and assess its applicability and relevance to their company's specific systems. Is this patch for software we actually use? Is it critical?
Okay.
Second, and this is crucial, they need to test the patch thoroughly, usually on isolated non-production systems first. Patches can sometimes have unintended side effects, breaking compatibility with other software, or causing performance issues. You don't want to roll out a patch that takes down your whole business.
Right. Test before deploying widely.
Absolutely. Third, once testing is successful, they need to plan the implementation with business managers, scheduling the deployment to minimize disruption to operations, perhaps during off hours or maintenance windows.
Coordination is key.
Very. Fourth is the actual deployment of the patch across the relevant systems. And finally, fifth, they need to validate that the patch was successfully installed and that it actually fixed the intended vulnerability, perhaps by running another vulnerability scan.
It's quite a process.
It is, and it needs to be managed carefully. Organizations often use specialized patch management software to help automate parts of this process. And because it involves changes to IT systems, the entire patch management process is typically subject to formal change management procedures and logs. Service auditors, again, like in an SOC2 engagement, will almost always inspect these patch management processes and change logs to ensure vulnerabilities are being addressed systematically and in a timely manner.
Okay. We've explored the frameworks, the technical defenses like firewalls and endpoint security, and the constant vigilance required for vulnerability and patch management. Now let's talk about how all these different pieces really fit together to create a truly robust, resilient security posture. It sounds like it's all about building layers of defense, not relying on just one thing.
That's exactly right. Relying on a single security control, no matter how strong it seems, is incredibly risky. That leads us to the concept of layered security.
So what's the core purpose of layered security?
The fundamental purpose is to protect an organization using a diversified set of security tactics and controls. The goal is to ensure that a single successful cyber attack or the failure of a single security component doesn't compromise the entire system or organization.
No single point of failure.
Precisely. It achieves this by combining different types of controls, typically physical controls, like locks and cameras, logical or technical controls, like firewalls and encryption, and administrative controls, like policies and training. Often it incorporates something called control redundancy.
Control redundancy, what does that add?
That's a crucial element within layered security. Control redundancy is implemented specifically to offset potential defects or failures in other controls, especially against multi-pronged breaches where attackers might try to bypass defenses in several ways simultaneously.
So if one layer fails,
Another layer is there, hopefully, to catch the attack or mitigate the impact. Think of it like having multiple locks on your front door, maybe a deadbolt, a chain lock, maybe even an alarm system. Each offers a different type of protection. If an attacker manages to pick the deadbolt, the chain might still slow them down, and the alarm might alert you.
okay, multiple obstacles.
Exactly. This layered strategy, using different types of controls and redundancy, significantly increases the effort, the time, and the resources an attacker needs to successfully achieve their objectives. It makes their job much harder.
And the most common application, or maybe the philosophy behind this layering, is often called defense in depth, right?
Defense in depth is probably the most well-known term for this comprehensive, multi-layered security strategy. So defense in depth really embodies this multi-layered approach, and critically, it explicitly acknowledges that you can't rely on technology alone. It understands that human elements, guiding principles, and physical security are just as crucial as the firewalls and antivirus software.
Right. So it's not just about buying the fanciest new tech gadget. It's about the people using it, the rules guiding them, and even the literal walls around the computer equipment.
Perfectly put. Defense in depth combines several key layers.
Okay, what are they?
First, personnel. You need to have knowledgeable experts, skilled IT professionals who can effectively operate the security functions and tools. They need the expertise to understand how all these different layers interact holistically and manage them effectively. Security tools are only as good as the people configuring and monitoring them.
People are layer one. Makes sense.
Second, policies. As we discussed earlier, while technology is critical, you absolutely need clear, well-defined policies governing how that technology should be used, how security processes should be implemented, and how everything should be monitored over time to determine if the tools and controls are actually working as designed. Policies provide the necessary guidance and rules.
People, policies. Then comes the tech.
Third, yes, technology. This layer includes all the technical controls we've been talking about, things like intrusion detection and prevention systems, ID, ISIP, robust antivirus and anti-malware software, network firewalls, web application firewalls, endpoint security solutions, encryption technologies, and so on.
Okay.
Fourth, physical access controls. Defense in depth recognizes that protecting digital assets often starts with protecting the physical infrastructure. This layer includes tangible security measures like surveillance cameras, security gates, locks on doors and server racks, fences around facilities, security guards, mandatory badge-controlled access systems for sensitive areas, and restricted access to climate-controlled data centers where the servers live.
Can't forget the physical locks.
Absolutely not. And finally, fifth, logical access controls. Complementing the physical controls, these are the rule-based controls carried out by software and hardware systems, specifically designed to prevent unauthorized digital access. They are embedded within user authentication systems, requiring login credentials, MFA, authorization mechanisms, defining permissions based on roles or attributes, and various permission-based methods that dictate what users can see and do within systems and applications.
Wow. So Defense in Depth paints this really comprehensive picture of security that extends way beyond just the digital realm. It goes into the physical world, it involves the procedures, it relies on the people, acknowledging that a security chain is only as strong as its weakest link, whether that link is human, procedural, technological, or even physical.
That's the core philosophy. Every layer provides protection, and ideally, they compensate for any weaknesses in other layers.
Now, within that Defense in-depth strategy, you mentioned redundancy and diversification. How does that specifically work to strengthen the layers?
The core idea behind redundancy and diversification as applied in layered security is essentially using two or more different means of security to protect the same resource or asset.
Okay, like having two different brands of firewall.
That could be one example of diversification, yes. The goal is to eliminate that single point of failure we talked about. It also helps organizations counter sophisticated attacks that might specifically target weaknesses in one particular type of controller technology. If you have diverse defenses, an attack technique effective against one might be completely ineffective against another.
So don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And sometimes you even see the concept of duplication within duplication. This might involve further bifurcating processes or access controls, maybe adding another person to review or approve a critical action just to introduce even more security checks and balances.
How is this kind of redundancy achieved in practice? What are the techniques?
There are several ways. One is through layering processes. This adds redundancy by deliberately breaking up a complex or critical operation into smaller, distinct chunks. These chunks can then be managed by different people, performed by different machines, or logically isolated from other parts of the process.
Why break it up?
It's often done to protect critical pieces of an operation or particularly sensitive information. Consider a high-security scenario, like accessing a bank vault.
Okay.
You might have one person responsible for granting remote electronic access or disabling certain alarms. A different person might be required to physically unlock the vault door. A third person might be responsible for actually removing the contents, and maybe a fourth transports them. All participants might need to count or reconcile the contents independently with the other employees involved.
Wow, lots of steps, lots of people.
Exactly. This layered process adds significant checks and balances. An attacker or even a malicious insider would need to compromise multiple independent steps and potentially multiple people to succeed. It makes collusion much harder.
Okay, that's layering processes. What else?
Then there's process isolation. This usually happens at the machine level. It involves segmenting processes running on the same computer using logical controls. typically enforced by the operating system, to create memory access constraints.
Memory access constraints.
Yeah, essentially, each process is allocated its own specific portion of system memory and is prevented from accessing the memory space allocated to other processes. They run separately in their own bubbles, even on the same hardware.
Why is that important?
It's done so that one process cannot improperly influence or interfere with another. Crucially, it prevents a bug, a crash, or even malicious code running within one application from directly crashing or compromising another application running concurrently on the same server. It helps limit the blast radius if something goes wrong in one process.
Containment again. Makes sense. What about hiding things?
That relates to abstraction and concealment. These are two related concepts often used in secure system design. Abstraction is primarily about hiding complexity. It involves presenting users or other systems with only the relevant information or functionality needed for a specific task while hiding the underlying technical details. In a security context, this helps limit what a user can see and do, making it easier for administrators to create and assign different privilege levels based on simplified interfaces or roles.
Okay, simplifying the view. How is concealment different?
While abstraction simplifies what you see and how you interact, concealment focuses more directly on hiding the data itself. It's typically implemented by assigning different security levels or classifications, like confidential or secret, to specific sets of data, sections of applications, or system objects. Users are also assigned security levels or clearances. Access is then granted only if the user's security level matches or exceeds the security level of the data they're trying to access.
So abstraction simplifies interaction, while concealment directly controls if you can see the data at all based on classification.
That's a good way to summarize the key distinction. Both contribute to limiting exposure.
Okay. And finally, you mentioned hardware segmentation earlier.
Yes, hardware segmentation achieves a similar goal to process isolation, keeping things separate. But instead of enforcing that separation logically through software controls on a single machine, it enforces it physically by using completely separate machines for different processes or security zones.
So literally different boxes.
Literally different physical servers or network devices. While this is generally more costly and complex to manage than logical isolation, physical separation offers the ultimate level of isolation. An attack on one machine simply cannot directly spread to another machine if they are physically distinct and potentially on different network segments.
Why isn't this used everywhere then if it's the ultimate isolation?
Mainly due to cost and complexity. It's not always practical or necessary for every application, but it's commonly used in high-security environments or for large, geographically distributed organizations that need to create highly resilient, physically isolated network segments, perhaps separating critical control systems from the general corporate network, for example. It provides the strongest form of segmentation when needed.
Okay, so we've built the conceptual house with frameworks like COSO. We've established the rules with policies and procedures. We've reinforced the structure with layers through defense in depth, using techniques like segmentation and redundancy. Now let's get really practical. How do these various defenses actually operate? How are they categorized in terms of what they do?
That's a great way to frame it. Cybersecurity controls, regardless of whether they're technical, administrative, or physical, can generally be grouped into three vital functional categories: preventative, detective, and corrective controls.
Prevent, detect, correct. Okay.
Yep. These three types work together, often across all the different points of discovery. We've talked about vulnerabilities, intrusions, policy violations, and at all stages of a potential counterattack or response. They form a complementary system.
Let's start with the first one, preventive controls. I assume these are about stopping bad things from happening in the first place?
Exactly right. Preventive controls are designed specifically to thwart malicious activity from ever occurring successfully. They aim to stop attackers or even accidental misconfigurations from gaining unauthorized access to devices, applications, data, and networks before any damage is done. They are proactive defenses.
What are some common examples of preventive controls? There must be a lot.
There are many spanning different areas we can think about. Safeguarding practices. This is a broad category encompassing strong software and hardware controls coupled with well-designed policies. Things we've already touched on, like enforcing strong passwords, mandating MFA, performing thorough background checks for privileged users, requiring employees to lock unattended devices, having strict guidelines for handling sensitive data. These are all preventive.
Okay, basic security hygiene.
Very much so. Also crucial is education and training. Informing employees about current cybersecurity risks, phishing tactics, social engineering, and the corporate tools and policies in place to mitigate those risks serves as a vital preventative measure. As you said earlier, your employees are often the first line of defense. Making sure they're well-trained and security-aware prevents many incidents.
Human firewall.
Kind of, yes. Regular security updates and maintenance are also preventative, continuously enhancing both physical security measures and logical security controls to keep up with evolving threats. Encryption, both for data at rest and data in transit, is a key preventive control. It converts sensitive data into an illegible format so that even if it is compromised or intercepted, it's unusable to the attacker without the decryption key.
Right. Makes stolen data worthless.
Hopefully. Firewalls, as we discussed, are classic preventive controls. They monitor and filter network traffic based on predefined rules, aiming to allow only trusted parties and legitimate traffic while blocking known malicious sources or unauthorized connection attempts.
Okay. What about patches? Are they preventative?
Patches are interesting because they can act as both preventive and corrective. Applying a patch before a vulnerability is exploited is clearly preventive. It closes the hole before it's used. Physical barriers are obviously preventive, tangible obstructions like locked doors, turnstiles, secure server cages, badge entry systems, security guards, fences, surveillance cameras. They prevent unauthorized physical access to IT infrastructure. Device and software hardening, which we covered, is fundamentally preventive of reducing the number of vulnerable points or attack surfaces available to an attacker.
Closing doors before they can be opened.
Precisely. And one more technical example. Intrusion prevention systems, IPS. These are network security solutions that actively monitor network traffic, detect malicious activity based on signatures or anomalies, and then automatically take action to block or stop the attack before it reaches its intended target system. This distinguishes them from IDS, which we'll get to. IPS is preventive.
Okay, lots of ways to prevent trouble. Within preventative controls, access controls seem like a huge part of it, determining who is allowed to access what in the first place. You mentioned authorization models earlier.
Yes, access controls based on different authorization models are critical preventive measures. They ensure that access to resources is granted only to authorized employees or systems based on predefined criteria. There are several common models organizations use to manage this.
Let's quickly recap those.
Sure, there's discretionary access control, DAC. This is a decentralized model where the owner of a resource, like the creator of a file, gets to decide who else can access it and what permissions they have. It offers flexibility but relies heavily on the owner making good security judgments. Common in standard operating systems like Windows or Linux for file permissions.
Okay, owner decides.
Then there's mandatory access controls, MAC, not to be confused with MAC addresses. This is a highly centralized model, usually enforced by the system administrator or based on system-wide security policies. Access decisions are based on security labels or classifications assigned to both users, clearance, and resources classification. It enforces consistent rules across the entire environment, often used in military or high security systems. It's less flexible, but simpler for enforcing rigid fixed rules.
Admin decides based on labels. Got it.
Role-based access control, RBAC, is extremely common in businesses. Access permissions are assigned based on a user's defined job role within the organization, like accountant, sales rep, system admin, rather than assigning permissions individually to each user. This is much more efficient and scalable for managing access in larger organizations with many users and defined job functions.
Access by job title. Makes sense.
Rule-based access control is slightly different. Access decisions are based on a predetermined set of rules or conditions, often independent of the user's specific role. The administrator sets the criteria, maybe allowing access only during certain times of day or only from specific network locations. The steps usually involve rules are created, integrated into the system, user credentials and context are checked against the rules, and access is granted or denied based on whether the rules are met.
Access based on rules, not just role.
Okay. Policy-based access control, PBAC, is a more sophisticated model that often combines elements of roles and rules. Access decisions are made dynamically by evaluating policies that consider multiple attributes. Maybe the user's identity, their role, their security clearance, the sensitivity of the data, the location, the time of day, the operational need, and even the current risk level. It's highly flexible and powerful for complex, growing organizations.
Dynamic and attribute-based.
And finally, risk-based access controls, which we touched on earlier. Here, the stringency of the access controls applied depends dynamically on the calculated risk level associated with the specific access attempt. It considers the sensitivity of the asset being accessed, the user's identity and typical behavior, maybe their location and their intentions. What are they trying to do? Higher perceived risk means stricter measures are enforced, like requiring MFA or limiting permissions, while lower risk access might only require a password.
Adapts controls based on risk. Very smart.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the models for deciding who gets access. How are these models actually implemented? What are the mechanisms?
Good question. Several technical controls implement these models. A very common one is the Access Control List, ACL.
ACL. Heard of that.
An ACL is basically a list of rules, usually associated with a specific resource like a file, a folder, a network connection, or a directory. It outlines which specific users or groups have permission to access that resource and what specific actions they are allowed to perform, like read, write, execute, delete. System administrators use ACLs to manage account restrictions.
So it's the list that enforces the rules.
Exactly. There are different types. A file system ACL operates at the operating system level to control access to files and folders. A networking ACL, often configured on routers or firewalls, regulates network traffic, allowing or denying packets based on source-to-destination IP addresses, ports, or protocols. Networking ACLs can also sometimes improve network performance by filtering out unwanted traffic.
How are ACLs different from firewalls then? They both filter network traffic.
It's a subtle distinction often based on complexity and focus. Generally, ACLs are simple rule sets often focused on user or IP-based permissions. Allow this user IP, deny that user IP. Firewalls, especially stateful firewalls, are typically more sophisticated. They not only filter based on rules, but also often track the state of network connections, inspect packet contents more deeply, deep packet inspection, and offer more advanced threat protection features. Stateful ACLs exist too, blurring the lines somewhat, but generally, firewalls provide broader network protection against malicious attacks, while ACLs are more focused on managing defined permissions.
Okay, that clarifies it. ACLs are part of the implementation toolkit, along with access restrictions, governing specific actions users can take, and of course those physical barriers we mentioned earlier, which are also implementation controls for physical access models.
Correct. All working together preventively.
Well, what happens if a threat slips past all these preventive measures? It happens, right?
It absolutely does. No prevention is 100% perfect. That's where the next category, detective controls, becomes essential.
Okay, detective controls. As the name suggests, these are about detecting things.
Precisely. Detective controls are designed specifically to detect a threat event, an intrusion, or a policy violation while it is occurring, or sometimes shortly after it has occurred. They also play a crucial role in providing information for investigations and audits after an event to understand what happened. They are your security cameras and alarm systems for the digital world.
Your early warning systems and forensic tools.
Yeah.
Got it. What are some common examples?
Several important ones fall into this category. A network intrusion detection system, NIDS, is a classic example. These systems monitor incoming, and sometimes outgoing, network traffic, analyzing it for patterns or signatures that match a library of known malicious attacks or suspicious activities. When a match is found, they generate alerts to notify security personnel.
Okay, it watches the network traffic for known bad stuff.
Right. Antivirus software monitoring also functions as a detective control. While its removal function is corrective, its real-time scanning of files as they are accessed or downloaded, comparing them against a known virus definition library, is detective. It also performs scheduled scans of the entire system to detect dormant malware. When it finds something, it alerts the user or administrator.
Gotcha. Watching files for viruses.
Network monitoring tools encompass a wide variety of technologies used for detection. This includes tools like packet sniffers, which capture and analyze individual data packets on the network, useful for troubleshooting or investigating suspicious traffic. Network performance monitoring, NPM tools, which measure network statistics like bandwidth usage, latency, packet loss, jitter, looking for anomalies that might indicate a problem or attack, and protocols like Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP, which allows administrators to monitor network devices for error rates, utilization, and other indicators of health or trouble.
Keeping an eye on the network's vital signs.
Exactly. Log analysis is another critical detective control. Almost all systems, applications, and network devices generate logs, records of events, errors, logins, access attempts, etc. Analyzing these logs, either manually or more commonly using automated security information and event management (SIEM) systems, allows organizations to detect anomalies, trends, or specific patterns that might indicate unauthorized access, policy violations, or ongoing attacks. These logs are the digital breadcrumbs that tell you the story of what happened during an incident.
So important for investigations after the fact.
Absolutely crucial for forensics. And related to NIDs, we have the broader category of intrusion detection systems, IDS. An IDS is a security solution which could be network-based, NIDs, or host-based, HIDs, running on individual computers, that scans the environment to monitor and analyze network or system events. Its primary job is to provide real-time warnings when it detects signs of potentially unauthorized access attempts, policy violations, or outright attacks in progress.
Now, you mentioned intrusion prevention systems, IPS, under preventive controls.
Yeah.
How is an IDS different? This always confuses me.
That's a very common point of confusion. The key distinction lies in their action. Remember, an IPS prevention actively tries to block or stop the detected attack before it succeeds. It intervenes.
Wow.
An IDS detection, on the other hand, typically only detects and alerts about an attack, often after it has already started or potentially even succeeded. It doesn't usually have the capability to automatically block the malicious traffic itself. It's like a burglar alarm that sounds the siren but doesn't lock the door.
Ah, okay, that's clear now. IDS detects and alerts, IPS detects and prevents blocks.
Exactly. So IDS is purely a detective control. And service auditors doing SOC2 work, for example, may inspect the configuration and alerting mechanisms of an organization's IDS-up solutions to ensure they have continuous monitoring capabilities in place.
Okay, so we've tried to prevent attacks, and we have systems in place to detect them if they get through. What happens next? We've found a problem, now what?
Now we move to the third category, corrective controls. Once a vulnerability has been exploited, an incident has occurred, or maybe even a weakness has been identified through a self-assessment or an industry alert, corrective controls come into play. Their purpose is to fix the known vulnerability or remediate the damage caused by the security incident.
So cleaning up the mess and patching the hole.
Essentially, yes. And importantly, once a corrective control is implemented and proof effective, it often transitions into becoming a preventative or detective control for the future. For instance, patching a vulnerability is corrective in response to its discovery, but the patch then acts preventively against future attempts to exploit that same flaw.
Right, it closes the loop. What are some examples of corrective controls?
Several actions fall under this category. Reconfigurations. This involves modifying the configuration settings of applications, operating systems, firewalls, or other systems specifically to rectify identified vulnerabilities or security weaknesses. For example, after an incident reveals overly permissive firewall rules, a corrective action would be to revamp those rules to be more restrictive, or maybe retooling OS security settings or altering access control permissions that were found to be too broad.
Adjusting the settings based on what went wrong.
Precisely. Upgrades and patches, as we discussed, are a major corrective control. Applying software or application upgrades or specific security patches is done to enhance performance, add features, but critically, to plug security holes and fix design flaws that were exploited or discovered.
Patching after the fact.
Right. Revised policies and procedures can also be a corrective control. Sometimes an incident reveals that the underlying process or policy was flawed. So periodically reviewing and revising organizational practices can eliminate security issues, sometimes without needing new technology at all. For example, after discovering that one person had too much conflicting access, a corrective action might be splitting that job function into two distinct roles to enhance segregation of duties, making fraud harder.
Fixing the process, not just the tech.
Exactly. Updated employee training is another powerful corrective measure, often implemented after incidents caused by human error or lack of awareness. It aims to reduce knowledge gaps about new cyber attack methods, teach employees how to better recognize fraud attempts or phishing emails, how to react appropriately during an incident, and ultimately how to change their behavior to be more security conscious.
Learning from mistakes.
Yes. In the face of major incidents like ransomware attacks or natural disasters, having robust recovery and continuity plans is essential. These plans outline the steps to quickly recover systems and data from backups, restore operations, and continue business functions, minimizing interruption. Executing these plans is a corrective action after a disaster strikes.
Getting back online after something bad happens.
Crucial. And going back to antivirus software, while its monitoring is detective, its ability to remove or expunge identified malicious viruses or malware from infected systems is a corrective action.
Cleaning the infected machine.
Right. And related to that is virus quarantining. Sometimes antivirus software or security administrators will isolate actual or suspected viruses or entire infected machines from the rest of the network. This quarantining action, whether automated or manual, is corrective because it stops the potential spread of the infection while further investigation or remediation takes place. Hashtag outro.
Wow. Okay. Prevent, detect, correct.
Yeah.
We have covered so much ground today, from the highest level strategic frameworks like COSO, setting the tone at the top, down through the specific policies like AUPs and BYOD that affect everyday users.
All the way to the nitty-gritty technical controls, firewalls, VPNs, endpoint hardening, authentication methods like MFA.
The constant cycle of vulnerability management, using scanners and assessments, keeping up with CVEs, managing patches, building those layers with defense in depth, and finally understanding how controls function as preventative, detective, or corrective. It's truly a complex, interconnected, multi-layered endeavor, isn't it?
It really is. And if there's one key takeaway, I think it's reinforcing that dynamic nature of cybersecurity we talked about. It's absolutely not a destination you arrive at where you can say, okay, we're secure now.
Right, that's never done.
Never. It's a continuous journey, a constant cycle of prevention, detection, and correction. The importance of that layered security approach, the defense-in-depth philosophy, and the absolute necessity of adapting to constantly evolving threats cannot be overstated. Attackers never stop innovating, refining their techniques, finding new angles, so defenders simply can't afford to stand still either.
A constant arms race, as you said. We've explored how organizations implement these robust strategies, from those high-level frameworks down to the specific technology guarding your Wi-Fi connection at the coffee shop used for work. But maybe here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. We've talked a lot about enterprise-level security. But what does this continuous evolution of threats and defenses mean for your own personal digital security? How might understanding these big organizational strategies, the layering, the MFA, the vulnerability awareness, how might that change how you approach protecting your own data, your personal devices, your online identity? Maybe it's about thinking in layers for your own home network, or being absolutely rigorous about using MFA on every single account that offers it, or being more skeptical of unexpected emails. Something to think about.
That's a great point. Applying these principles personally is just as important.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of cyber attack mitigation. We hope you found these insights valuable and that they've turned some of that complexity into clear, maybe even actionable knowledge.
Hope it was helpful.
Join us next time as we take another complex topic and try to do the same. Thanks for listening.